Okay, this morning we heard Cass Demrose talk about functional restoration. He mentioned it as an outcome of a meeting in Pittsburgh that the Forest Service organized in early February. And this is actually my talk from that meeting, Ecologically Appropriate Plant Materials for Functional Restoration. My remarks are summarized in a handout on the back table towards the right end of it. It's a two-page handout. It has a watermark that says draft across it if you're interested. We're all familiar with what's gone on in the Intermountain region. On the left panel, the pristine ecosystem of the sagebrush steppe, the loss of the understory, invasion of cheatgrass, which provides fine fuels for wildfire in the upper right, the removal of vegetation, and then eventually we end up with a cheatgrass monoculture. I believe it was Val that showed this diagram of Steve Wisnitz at Texas A&M showing the two thresholds, the biotic threshold on the left that separates phase A and phase B, and then the abiotic threshold B and C. So when you're still in phase A, you've still got most of your processes functional. You may have some loss of ecosystem function. That's what's being measured in the y-axis. But after that biotic threshold has been crossed, for example, the loss of the perennial bunch grasses, the invasion of cheatgrass, the curve starts to deteriorate at a steeper rate. Here you're going to need more concrete measures, seeding required, and of course this stage C is when we have the greatest problem, yet the greatest opportunity to resolve the problem through seeding. But once the abiotic threshold is crossed and we have modifications in soil, structure, and function, and move into stage C, the problem is much more intractable. And so functional restoration, we're dealing with these sorts of problems and trying to restore ecosystem function. So state and transition models, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. Notice there are negative feedbacks and positive feedbacks, and Andrew talked quite a bit about plant soil feedbacks. There's a switch in the center that represents this threshold. When that switch is thrown, the threshold is crossed, so you move from state 1 on the left to state 2 on the right. The problem is that state 2 is not as desirable as state 1, and the only way to get back to state 1, it's problematic, and that's what we really need to do to affect functional restoration. So the negative feedbacks in both cases, what they do is really stabilize the state, if it's either state 1 or state 2. So you can see those arrows going to the edges of the slide. Positive feedbacks are factors that are promoting a move to the alternate state, so that they're pointed towards the center where the switch or the threshold is located. Dave Brisky, also at Texas A&M University, and his colleagues have provided this graph. You can see the threshold, which is the shaded column with a hump in the middle, where the feedback switch is located. On the left of that shaded column, negative feedbacks exceed positive feedbacks. The pre-threshold state is maintained. And this is shown pictorially here by a trough. So it's hard for that, it's unlikely that the ball is going to move outside of that trough unless the positive feedbacks are so great they're able to push it over that threshold. And you get the situation on the right where negative feedbacks are less than positive feedbacks. Once you cross this threshold, you've got another problem. You've got a series of thresholds, structural, species loss, functional, and eventually leading to property extinction. So the point is the longer it's been since you crossed the threshold, changes continue to accrue, and you're falling deeper and deeper and deeper into a situation that cannot be reversed. This is our dilemma. So what I proposed is a way to think about this in terms of plant materials. What we need to do is close this performance gap. So we have time here on the x-axis and level of plant material performance on the y-axis. As these problems continue and accumulate, the performance of the plant material necessary to meet the increasing environmental challenge is increasing. And so we're seeing this in our systems. They're becoming more and more difficult to restore over time. When we use local material, there's a certain level of plant material performance, but that local plant material is consistent across time. So it's, if we use local material, that gap between the heavy black line and the local material line becomes wider and wider. However, there is such a thing known as contemporary evolution. This has been alluded to before. Plant materials can adapt to new and changing conditions, for example, global climate change or some of these other changes. And the more genetic variation they have, the more likely they're able to do this. And in this response to environmental change through natural selection, when it can occur in rapidly short time frames, is known as contemporary evolution. And that's what that dashed arrow, upward arrow, represents, contemporary evolution. But if we use a plant material that is what I'm going to be speaking about, which we call ecologically appropriate at time A, we can call it EA, or ecologically appropriate plant material number 1. The idea is to provide something with a higher level of plant material performance that also has the potential for contemporary or rapid evolution, again with the arrow. And over time, release plant materials that help to narrow that performance gap. The way we might do this, Tom Monaco, my colleague at Logan, and Jeremy James, who'll be speaking tomorrow, we thought about this a lot, and we're thinking in terms of functional traits for functional restoration. In short, a functional trait is a plant trait that confers adaptation. It's not a trait that, for example, like color of the iris, that doesn't really affect ability to persist or reproduce. You can see some of these traits on the right. I'm not going to go into them, but the point is they're tied to the middle column, ecological processes. So we have traits that impact certain ecological processes, and these ecological processes can be targeted with these traits. And then groups of these ecological processes, the idea is to use them to overcome obstacles towards restoration. So you can say for example, an obstacle of a priority effect. This means, for example, that a cheatgrass has priority over a perennial bunch grass if it germinates faster or gets to the site first. It has the upper hand. And so the ecological processes that are associated with the priority effect obstacle are dispersal, germination, emergence. The functional traits that can confer each of those are what are shown. A second obstacle in the left-hand column is interference. This is the desirable and the undesirable plant, their interaction. And the third is positive feedback types, and I've just spoken a little bit more about positive feedbacks. But this paper is available on the back table if you're interested. It's published in Rangelands. The other thing I want to talk about is general adaptation and local adaptation. The way these studies are done is with reciprocal transplants. Now this has been talked about before by some of these previous speakers. So what we're talking about is looking at two plant populations. One is from site A. Population A is from site A. Population B is from site B. And so we're going to compare two populations, A and B, at each of their two native sites, A and B. Okay? So there are different outcomes when we make this comparison. What we call local adaptation is when population A performs best or better than B at site A, and population B performs better than A at site B. You see, each local is best adapted at its home site. That's the idea behind local adaptation. Now, general adaptation is a little bit different. And there are two ways it could occur in this simple example. So you see two rows that say general adaptation. The first is that population A does better than B at both site A and B. The second way we can have general adaptation is population B does better than site A at both site A and site B. So you can see that there's a general tendency for A to be superior across sites, or a general tendency for population B to be better across both sites. Okay, that's what general adaptation is. The third possibility is local maladaptation. This is really the reverse of local adaptation. So instead of A performing best at site A, it performs worse. Instead, B performs best at site A, and the reverse occurs at the other site. Site A is better at site B. So it's the reverse of what you'd expect for local adaptation. Now, the reason I've introduced this is that there have been two extensive meta-analysis studies published recently. So a meta-analysis is when people, I think Andrew mentioned this, he had done a meta-analysis on feedbacks. And so these two papers, Herford in 2009, Lehmu and Fisher in 2010, they went to literature and found all kinds of studies, as many as they could find that met their criteria, where these kind of data, multiple plant materials are at multiple sites, these data had been recorded. And so they came up with a pretty large sample size. The first one had 892 one-on-one comparisons, A versus B comparisons. Lehmu and Fisher had over 1,000. But in both cases, 71% of these comparisons, they found that local was superior to non-local. So obviously, if the number was 50%, that means there's no advantage to being local. But the number was higher than that. It was 71%. It isn't 100%, so 29% of the cases, non-local was superior. However, there are reasons to think that this 71% number may be an overestimate. First of all, these are one-on-one comparisons, so it reflects not local is best, but local is better than one other randomly chosen population. Another issue is that oftentimes authors choose their sites to be intentionally quite different because they're looking for local adaptation. This is something scientists do and need to be upfront about. So that kind of inflates that number. The third thing is what Steve Parr and Val Anderson referred to, and that is when we do plant material development in what's been called today the traditional way, we're looking for plant materials with improved performance, and there's a lot of testing that goes into that. These comparisons are done not on plant materials, but on materials that were just found on natural sites. There was no plant material development or comparison work done on them. So if we're talking about plant materials, this number might be high. But the interesting thing that, and I point out that the results of the two meta-analyses are very similar, which makes these findings very robust. A lot of these authors have both pointed out that many people have commonly regarded local adaptation to be the rule, not the exception. But what both of these meta-analyses indicate is that the frequency of local adaptation, which I described on the previous slide, is very similar to the frequency of general adaptation. Okay? But there are much lesser levels of local maladaptation. In a 2009 paper that's available on the back table in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment Journal, Tom Monaco and myself proposed something called assisted evolution. And this is the idea that I mentioned in an earlier slide, that we need to develop plant materials that can evolve on their own, that have the genetic potential to do that, because environments will change, as has been pointed out earlier this morning, and we can't always predict what that change is going to be. So I proposed an alternative paradigm to the local is best paradigm called local has value. And so assisted evolution is about plant materials that, one, reflect general historical evolutionary patterns. This gets back to what R.C. has talked about preserving that diversity on the landscape. Second, they display fitness in the modified environment, not just the previous pristine environment. Because most restoration environments have been modified. That's why we're doing restoration with them, or attempting to do restoration. Third, they must be able to adapt to contemporary selection pressures. And last, contribute to the restoration of ecological structure and function, not just the entities, taxonomic entities that are in place. So that's what assisted evolution is about. And so further developing this idea about ecologically appropriate plant materials. In the back again, there's an article that just came out this month in Bioscience about ecologically appropriate plant materials. This is an alternative to what are known as genetically appropriate plant materials, which are the things that R.C. and Francis were talking about, seed transfer zones. Okay. So ecologically appropriate plant materials would be those that display ecological fitness on their intended site, ecological fitness being the ability to grow, reproduce, persist on a site. They must display compatibility with other members of the plant community, other species. They would display no invasive tendency and are synonymous with genetically appropriate plant materials for pristine ecosystems. In other words, genetically appropriate plant materials or local plant materials from the seed transfer zones are the most ecologically appropriate plant materials. So it was said earlier today that probably the local or the pristine sites function best, and that's what I'm really saying here in point 4. So in contrasting these two paradigms, genetically appropriate and ecologically appropriate for various features as shown in the left-hand column. The paradigm for genetically appropriate, local is best. For EA, local has value. For GA, we're talking more about pristine ecosystems, and for EA, novel ecosystems, and I'll be talking more about novel ecosystems tomorrow. The restoration objective for GA plant materials oftentimes is a preservation objective, and that's what R.C. mentioned. Whereas for EA materials, the primary purpose is ecosystem repair. GA materials appeal to population-level ecologists and botanists, and EA materials are more likely to appeal those with training in ecosystem-level ecology. GA materials are most appropriate or more appropriate when there are steep environmental gradients, like we saw for the specialist species Douglas fir on a map earlier today. And EA materials would be more appropriate for environments that are more homogeneous over a larger scale. And there are some differences in species between the GA plant material and the EA plant material, these two paradigms. Species that are specialists have unique or come from unique or extreme environments that are rare species or have limited distributions, have long generation times, for example, woody plants, those in which the seed production must be produced in situ, like in a lot of conifers, we must produce seeds, cones from these forests used on site. This is where the genetically appropriate and localist best paradigm is of greatest value. But some other species characteristics may be more in sync with the EA approach. For example, generalist species, environments that are common throughout the landscape, species that have widespread distributions and short generation times, for example, grasses, and those in which we can do ex situ seed production in a cultivated setting, off-site. Okay, we can't really do that very well with trees because they're so long-lived, but we can do it. The seed industry knows all about doing this with herbaceous species, for example. Okay, and I've already mentioned the restoration gene pool concept today and how this relates to that. Again, those two papers are available on the back table. So I thank you very much.